Hello everyone. Today I am going to start giving a primer on Lutheran Scholastic Philosophy. So we are covering something that really isn't known that well in the English language. There's a lot of German scholarship out there. Of course, if you can read German, you'll be able to read the scholarship. There's a lot of Latin, like actual primary sources. If you know Latin, you can read them. But unfortunately, there's not way too much in English in terms of the philosophy. Some of our Lutheran scholastics have been translated, especially with respect to theology, but a lot of their philosophical works simply do not exist in English, apart from the most recent translations that I have been doing alongside other people working in our general online sphere. And so I thought it would be valuable that people would get an introduction to Lutheran scholastic philosophy to see the general tendencies and trends. With that in mind, this video is not an introduction to scholasticism, nor is it an introduction to Lutheranism. There are plenty of resources out there for both. I aim to introduce the philosophical system of the Lutherans specifically. I'm going to go over some of the most important figures in the Lutheran philosophical tradition, and so I'll give a broad overview of them at the way end of the series. But I am not going to cover every single figure. This can't be such an expansive video because that's just not possible. It's like saying I will make a video that covers every single figure in the Thomist tradition. That's just not possible. Nonetheless, there are some general tendencies that we can recognize, and I think it would be valuable to cover that as well as look at some of the most important figures. So, as a background, you should probably know, again, Lutheranism, as I said, since this video is not an introduction to that. If you know even just the basics of the Augsburg Confession, the unaltered Augsburg Confession, that is, and you know, say, the Large Catechism and Small Catechism, you're probably going to be fine. Ideally, you know the Formula of Concord as well, but that's not absolutely necessary. Generally speaking, if you know the Augsburg Confession and just the general ideas surrounding Lutheranism, you're probably going to be fine. As with scholasticism, if you generally know the thought of somebody like Aquinas, you'll be okay for a lot of this. I'll do my best to explain things in ways that are digestible for those who are not as familiar, but it's going to be very difficult to understand if you don't know anything about scholasticism, and there will be some areas where I'll need to explain, even if you know the thought of somebody like Aquinas or maybe even Scotus, just because there are some unique ideas found in the Lutherans. With that in mind, I am going to begin this series covering the influences on Lutheran scholastic philosophy. Now, it should go without saying, of course, that with respect to the influences, being an influence does not mean wholesale affirmation. So these figures I'm going to mention, by no means do the Lutherans say every single thing that they say is true. Instead, somebody could be an influence insofar as they agree with a lot of what they say, or they engage with them in a lot of ways and develop their system around looking at the insights that they have. In a wide sense, we can say that opponents of somebody are influences on them insofar as they force them to grapple with ideas that they present. And so, please, as you hear this, don't think, oh my gosh, if they're influenced by them, I have to affirm every single thing this person believes. That's not the case. In the same way, you don't have to hold every single thing that the Lutherans hold. Philosophically, you can be, in my mind, a Lutheran who holds to a different school of philosophy generally. Does that mean it's going to be the best school for Lutheranism? That's debatable, but I'm sure you could find a way to make things match. In general. Of course, I'm not speaking of like some modern absurdism or nihilism or something like that, but some kind of generally theistic, kind of optimistic system, I think, can work with this. So you are not, as a Lutheran, if you are a Lutheran watching this, bound to affirm that everything that's said in these videos. I mean, there are figures within the Lutheran philosophical tradition that disagree with each other. And so you are not supposed to say, oh my gosh, Kalov says this, therefore I have to believe this on philosophy. That's just not the case. But it's valuable to look at what they say because there is a reason that certain tendencies of philosophy occur in the Lutherans. It simply will make a lot of sense with their theology. So with that in mind, let's begin this series with the influences on Lutheran scholastic philosophy, knowing that there will be other sections of this kind of research that I will cover in later videos. The two most important influences on Lutheran scholastic philosophy are the Aristotelian Renaissance and Baroque scholasticism, especially as found in the thought of Francisco Suarez. So let's begin with the Aristotelian Renaissance. The Aristotelian Renaissance was influential on the Lutherans in a variety of ways, but one of the most notable, of course, is not necessarily in terms of its actual conclusions with respect to logic or metaphysics or something like that, but really just with respect to the emphasis on reading Aristotle directly and engaging with the scholarship of the Aristotelian Renaissance. This, of course, as I said earlier, does not mean that the Lutherans agree with them in every single area. So Johannes Scharf, again, a figure I mentioned earlier, he was a notable Lutheran logician, openly criticizes Scaliger and Zabarella in his Institutions of Logic. Meanwhile, Johann Heinrich Posewitz, admittedly a minor figure in Lutheran scholasticism, though I think a solid representative nonetheless, openly opposes certain ideas of Scaliger, like the idea that God cannot be called being in a proper sense, at least when compared to other names like entity, goodness, or mercy. And for context, these terms are being used in the abstract. At the very least, what's going on here is that the Lutherans were influenced by the Aristotelian Renaissance in the fact that they were being pushed back to Aristotle. Scharf has a phenomenal comment on this. So this is a longer quote. Quote, "Only this, friendly reader, I would wish you to observe and remember that indeed, in these later institutions, I've added many things, also changed many things, yet know that all this has been done for the sake of logical use and love of truth, namely the use of discourse in this argumentative art, has always been the supreme law for me. What seemed to fit more perfecting that, I also judged more eligible, as it will be clear in its place. But in all things I have so moderated myself that I would not rashly go against the received and approved opinions or judgments of our teachers or other good men. Indeed, to say what the matter is, I do not bring forth new dogmas, nor recent ones, but taken from Aristotle's organon itself, and the foundations of older interpreters. That is, I generally proceed by a purely Aristotelian method. I constantly accept terms according to the sense of Aristotle. I use Aristotelian foundations everywhere. I only explain more fully, as the matter arises, those things which were concisely stated by Aristotle. I partly retain Aristotle's definitions, partly explain them with equivalent descriptions. Indeed, you will find many things in this book which are not actually contained in the philosopher's organon, yet you will by no means think that these are immediately contrary to Aristotle's principles, perhaps in those things in which other approved authors also depart from the common Aristotelian opinion." End quote. So what Scharf's going on here is the idea that he is not departing in this work on logic from Aristotle, either purely in terms of the content that he actually takes straight from Aristotle's logical works, or just from the general spirit of Aristotelian logic. And so there are things he's going to cover in this work that Aristotle does not directly say, but he thinks nonetheless fit within the Aristotelian scheme. And so this means that the Lutherans are influenced by Aristotle, of course, but you could trace a solid amount of that to the Aristotelian Renaissance. There's a reason that the Lutherans were discovering this around this time. It makes a lot of sense. I would say that the Lutherans were especially influenced by them in the following terms. So, logic, grammar, languages from the Italian Renaissance, especially with Scaliger and Zabarella. As I said earlier, just a general attention to the early sources like Aristotle, Plato, Homer, among others, that you see in just some kind of general Renaissance going back to ancient Greece. There's also a structure and style of their works being influenced by this Renaissance. So classical Latin is used, and they also avoided unnecessary terminology all too often found in scholasticism. This is also something that we'll see mixed with the Baroque scholasticism. This is something influential on Suarez too. And so you could see it both in the Aristotelian Renaissance way and the Baroque scholasticism, in that the Baroque scholasticism is itself influenced by the Aristotelian Renaissance. We'll return to that soon. Of course, there are some notable ideas that we find. Traducianism is an important one in Scaliger. Just the general Aristotelianism. I mean, we see this in the formula of Concord, the use of substance, accident, and so on. There are some metaphysical influences of Scaliger as well, but in a lot of ways, the logic, grammar, and natural philosophy of Zabarella are also very important. As for specific figures, so Giacomo Zabarella was especially notable for his works on logic. He was an Italian philosopher and logician whose natural philosophy and logic, at least the books that is, were used as the basis for many Aristotelian textbooks in Germany. So it would make a lot of sense that your Lutherans who were in Germany were being trained or were reading logical works from Zapparella and hence were influenced by him. And they're often pretty clear about this. As for the ideas, I mentioned a few already, but for Zapparella specifically, beyond just his general understanding of logic, in terms of the actual content of that logic, one of the things Zapparella says that's fairly useful for the Lutherans is that logic is not properly a science or an art, but properly an instrument of the sciences. So sometimes you'll see somebody like Scharf speak of logic as artistic, but he's most properly looking at it in terms of instrument of the sciences and the arts. So this obviously suits the idea that we find in Lutherans that reason can be used ministerially, which is good. So this is something that they develop quite importantly for engagement with other groups, to say that we can use reason, but we can't use it to overthrow what the text says. And as such, logic is primarily a tool of other sciences and arts. And so this kind of insight from Zapparella makes a lot of sense for them. Just for a brief citation here, Cornelius Martini in his Logical Disputations Against the Ramist, the first thesis, he speaks of Zapparella as most learned. So clearly, Cornelius Martini, who I'll cover in a later video, a really important Lutheran on philosophy, takes Zapparella very seriously. And then Scharf, as I've mentioned, cites him positively a lot, but also important to remind you in this video, he's willing to criticize him. Influence, as I said, is not purely just agree on everything. It's engage with the ideas, agree at many times, and disagree at others. As for Scaliger, Scaliger was an Italian scholar known for his defense of Aristotelianism. He was using the discoveries of Renaissance humanism to do so. Gerhard cites him a few times, just off the top of my head, on the nature of theology and scripture. So Gerhard, even in a theological work, is going to use Scaliger. So Scaliger was influential also on Lutheran scholastic Albert Graver, I think that's how you say his name, in terms of his idea that the created world was the best of all possible worlds. This is something that we can see on also somebody like Leibniz as well, who a lot of people don't know this, but it is fairly useful. Leibniz was actually trained by Johann Adam Scherzer. Off the top of my head, I don't think that Johann Adam Scherzer taught that the existing world is the greatest of all possible worlds. Nonetheless, it is recognizable that Leibniz was influenced by Lutheran scholastics, and it wouldn't shock me that having somebody like Scaliger influence Lutheran scholastics and have perhaps Leibniz read him. I'm not 100% sure if he did. It would make sense that if he did, he would hold this, and this is something that everybody knows we see in him with his theodicy. He's very famous for this exact idea. Scaliger also affirmed traducianism, which is a very interesting topic to cover. It's something that the Lutherans generally hold. It's not something that, from my understanding, you absolutely must hold to be a Lutheran. I know some Lutheran pastors that are in good standing in the LCMS that do not hold to traducianism, and I have no issues with their orthodoxy, but a lot of the Lutherans are going to say traducianism makes the most sense of the doctrine of original sin. So Jacob Martini has a treatise on this. Cornelius Martini talks about it. I believe Chemnitz and Gerhard both cover it. Scaliger may have not be the only one that influenced them on this, but I think Scaliger discussing it may have been important for them. So, for our purposes, though, Scaliger had this works, the Exoreticae Exhortationes. I may have pronounced that wrong. This was a work that was influential on the Lutherans and the Calvinists in terms of metaphysics. There's a figure named Kuni Sakamoto who says that Scaliger's deep metaphysics, this is a quote from him, Scaliger's deep metaphysics exert an impact on various intellectual quarters. It provides some Lutherans with a theoretical platform from which they could develop their confessionalized doctrines in contradistinction to different denominations. That's the end of the quote. So, according to Sakamoto here, Scaliger's metaphysics really influenced the Lutherans and their ability to distinguish themselves at a philosophical level as they're interpreting their own confessional documents in distinction from these other groups. So, that's a fairly important thing. Kalov also cites Scaliger as a great reference for the Latin language, and Christoph Schiebler cites Scaliger multiple times in his treatise on quantity. Now, obviously, Philip Melanchthon, what could we say about him? There's so much. There's so much we could say. Anybody who knows the history of Lutheranism is going to know Melanchthon, at some level. But what we're going to recognize, at the very least with respect to philosophy, is something really interesting, that the Lutherans in general tried to defend Melanchthon as much as possible, both in philosophy and theology, though they recognized where he erred. They really did their best to defend somebody that was their master in a lot of ways. What's interesting about it is they don't try to say, oh, he actually for sure held our views at the end of his life, therefore we can hold it. A lot of them were just really protective of him when he was right and didn't want to discard him wholesale. Now we can look at Baroque scholasticism. So Baroque scholasticism is quite a large movement that we could cover in a lot of ways, but for our purposes, we really want to primarily look at Suarez and the Jesuits. Something we must acknowledge. We simply cannot forget that the Lutherans in Germany, they were definitely aware of the various schools surrounding them and were influenced by them, though not, again, agreeing with them entirely. So the Reformed were also active in Germany. They were in the Netherlands and other countries as well. So they were aware of the Reformed, as you see in somebody like Calab and others who are engaging directly with Reformed scholastics. The Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits, of course, were active all over. The most influential group for our purposes, though, as it shows up in the Lutherans, is going to be the Jesuits in Spain at the University of Salamanca. Most notably, of course, being Francisco Suarez. We could, of course, look at Thomas Aquinas. What's to say about Thomas Aquinas we don't already know? With respect to the Lutherans, though, Cornelius Martini refers to him as a very learned man and praises him among the scholastics, and Johann Gerhard speaks positively of him, especially in natural theology. And if you look at Gerhard's arguments for God's existence, they're really similar to Aquinas's. They're very similar. One of the greatest works on Lutheran metaphysics is called German Scholastic Metaphysics in the 17th Century by Max Wundt. He has a great quote on this. Quote, "This authoritative standing of Thomas also influences Protestant doctrine. He is regarded as the greatest teacher of the Middle Ages, one who is most just to all doctrinal differences and whose authority is willingly acknowledged. His influence is stronger on the Lutheran side, while the Reformed tradition maintains greater independence. That certain teachings are occasionally adopted from other scholastics, Scotus, and even the nominalists, should not be denied. However, for the foundational perspectives, Thomas is generally the guiding authority. In any case, the mistaken notion of more recent times that the great philosophy of the Middle Ages was purely Catholic and irrelevant to Protestants is far removed from the mindset of this era." End quote. And so Aquinas has some influence. I would argue personally that he has a lot of influence through those interpreting him in the Suarist school, but that's not to say that the Lutherans were not direct engaging with him through, say, his Summa Theologiae. We see this a lot, and anybody who's read somebody like Gerhard is going to recognize he cites Aquinas a lot, either agreeing with him or disagreeing. And as for the philosophy, we would just have to get into this question of how similar is Suarez to Aquinas, but I would just say off the top of my head, we can recognize that, generally speaking, the Lutherans are going to agree with Aquinas on a solid amount, of course, with respect to things like Trinitarian theology broadly, with respect to the doctrine of God, divine simplicity broadly, and so on, where I think they would fit more so in the Thomist camp on those two fronts at the least, more so than, say, the Scotus camp, though I think it makes a lot of sense to put them as Suarists for the most part. Duns Scotus also had a bit of an impact, but it really wasn't a serious amount in the same way that Suarez was, who we're going to cover in a second. Max Wundt, again, he suggests that the division of the affections of being was quite important for the Lutherans. This is obviously true when you look at the way they structure their textbooks and the way they cover things. And he thinks that this can primarily be traced back to Scotus. So in that way, you could say that Scotus was influential on the Lutherans, though it is fairly minor comparatively. And again, this is something that you see in somebody like Suarez as they continue. Anyway, I've talked so much about Suarez. Now I should actually examine what he says. I've said so mtil things in passing. So, the Lutherans were most significantly influenced by Francisco Suarez. I have to say this, I always have to laugh about this, the Van Til cult, that, and not all of them are cultish towards Van Til. But the massive group of presuppositionalists that think that Aquinas is like the worst thing in the world, they're probably tearing their hair out of their heads right now, because you think Aquinas is bad in terms of his theology relevant to the Reformation. Francisco Suarez was a counter-Reformation figure. I mean, he openly wrote against them. You could say Aquinas had the benefit of the doubt, not being around the time of the Reformation. You cannot do such a thing with Suarez. But nonetheless, I mean, the Lutherans are working with the thought of Suarez. So this shows a pattern of the Lutherans having an ability to recognize when somebody is wrong on something, but also agree with them on something that they find them quite good on. And I don't think we should discard that. But that's for another video, perhaps. Anyway, Suarez was a contemporary of early Lutheran philosophers, so early on we don't really see his stuff as influential. A good example of this is, again, according to Max Blunt, Cornelius Martini began teaching metaphysics in 1597. He was the first Protestant to ever teach metaphysics at the university, fun fact. And at that point, he didn't really show any influence from Suarez. But later on, Cornelius Martini, after Suarez publishes, at the very least, I believe it's his Metaphysical Disputations, Martini cites him quite approvingly and positively. There are just, a lot of ways in which Suarez influences the Lutherans, so I'll try to keep it brief here. Number one is his Metaphysical Disputations was the standard textbook on metaphysics throughout Germany, besides in Altdorf, where some kind of unique Aristotelianism was maintained. Pretty much every Lutheran scholastic that you read after around the time of Suarez that's engaging with philosophy, at the very least metaphysics, they are going to look at Suarez. That's just how it is. So there's an emphasis on causal analysis in Suarez, and we see this in Gerhard and Quenstedt and Hallatz, among others. Anybody who's read a work of Gerhard, practically anything, is going to see that he's going to analyze things in terms of their efficient cause, their formal cause, material cause, final cause, and so on. And you could make an argument that a lot of that influence is from somebody like Suarez. Now, is it unique to Suarez? Not really, but he develops a lot on this. Some would say that was one of his biggest, most important contributions as a scholastic, was a significant time spent on causal analysis. Next, of course, and this is a very controversial one. I want to make it clear again that you do not have to agree with the Lutherans on this to be a Lutheran, but Suarez, so he affirms middle knowledge and a kind of libertarian free will at a metaphysical level. I mean, the Lutherans generally held this too. So I need to note, of course, that when I talk about libertarian free will, I'm not talking about man's ability to choose God prior to grace. It's just a matter between man's activity and God's activity in all things, so not merely spiritual matters. This is something that would apply even prior to the fall, and even if the fall did not happen, it never happened, let's say, this would still be a philosophical question. And so the Lutherans in general seem to take a middle knowledge view. Certainly Kalov does, and it appears that Gerhard does from my reading. And so that's fairly influential. There's a great quote from John Cronin, who's a translator of Johann Adam Scherzer's, some of his work, in a book called The Axiomata Resoluta. Cronin has a nice note. Quote, "The Reformed found Aquinas' very Augustinian doctrine of predestination quite congenial, while the Lutherans decidedly did not, turning instead the thought of Suarez, in particular his doctrine of middle knowledge, to find ways to reconcile God's foreknowledge with human freedom." So he's just straight saying the Reformed tend to go with Aquinas' interpretation of Augustine. The Lutherans were actually often going to Suarez instead. Another thing that Cronin does in another work, a paper on Suarez's influence on David Hallatz and then the Reformed author Francis Turretin, he suggests that one of the reasons that Hallatz does not, when looking at arguments for God, include Aquinas' first way, is that he may have shared those same concerns regarding the physical pre-motion that Suarez had. And so we can't be absolutely sure, but it would make sense that with the heavy Suarez influence on the Lutherans, someone like Hallatz would not look at or use the argument that Aquinas does his first way, which would imply physical pre-motion. Further, this is just another small example with respect to causality. So Scherzer Johann Adam Scherzer, the figure I mentioned earlier, some have called him the Leipzig Calov. He was, again, Leibniz's teacher. Spoke of causality in terms of instilling being, which is clear Suarist language. There's also a general tendency of the Lutherans to deny the real distinction between essence and existence. Also, there's just the general understanding of the divine nature. As I said, with respect to Aquinas, between Aquinas and Scotus, you could make an argument that the Lutherans generally went more with Aquinas, but realistically, between all of them, Suarez is probably the most influential. We can't separate Suarez, of course, from Thomas and Scotus insofar as he's reacting to the two of them and tries to, in some ways, synthesize Thomas, Scotus, and the nominalists. Just he's trying to do that, and it's really a remarkable attempt at the very least. But out of the three of them, it seems to me that a lot of the figures are most influenced by perhaps Suarez, though somebody like Calov and others are going to make their own kinds of innovations, and we can't reduce them. I'll get back to that soon. Of course, there's also just straight up the affirmation, the analogy of being, as found in Suarez. That's something I see just all over the Lutherans, an affirmation of the analogy of being. Suarez also has a theory of potency that has some real actuality in it. It's not merely being created with actual substances. So Scherzer sees the actuality of prime matter as necessary to account for substantial change, while the Thomists say that the lack of actuality is what's necessary. I believe he actually just straight says that he agrees with Scotus and with Suarez on this over and against the Thomists. There's probably also some influence from Suarez on the theory of universals. That's something that, there's so much you have to research on that. Suarez's theory of universals and whether he's a nominalist or a realist, a conceptualist. That's like its own really complex debate. But from my reading, at the very least, of somebody like Scherzer, it seems to me that there is influence from Suarez there. Finally, I should say that in terms of concrete ideas, Suarez's theory of suppositum is quite important. So, John Cronin, again, commenting in Scherzer, or in his translation of Scherzer's Axiomata Resoluta, says, quote, according to Suarez, whom Scherzer followed on this matter, the supposit consists of the intrinsically individual nature of a thing, plus a certain mode of subsistence that completes it and renders it incommunicable to any other supposit. This doctrine achieved a great prominence in Lutheran Christology. And just a few more comments here. Johann Heinrich Posewitz, admittedly a less notable figure. Again, I've mentioned him earlier, but it bears repeating that even though he's a less notable figure, I think he is a solid representative of the Lutheran tradition. At points in his various writings, just will tell his readers, if you want to understand something more, go read Suarez on this. Just read Suarez, and he'll give the exact metaphysical disputation and just say, read this. That's not to say he doesn't do it with anybody else. He does it with also like Fonseca, who's pretty important. I think he also does it with Mendoza. He's also, Suarez, that is, massively influential on Christoph Schiebler, to the point where Schiebler is just called the Protestant Suarez. And Cronin has a comment that, in terms of being a pure philosopher, Schiebler is probably the best the Lutherans ever had. So, this, of course, is not to say that every Lutheran philosopher agreed with him universally on every single thing. Posewitz cites Scotus against Suarez, for example, on the idea that form is that which gives a substance its specific being. And then, theologically, of course, we disagree with Suarez on a myriad of issues. So, at the very least, what happens is that the Lutherans engage with him, especially, disagreeing with him at times, but notably agreeing with him a lot. And so, if you really want to have a thorough, solid understanding of Lutheran scholasticism, I would venture to guess that understanding Suarism is going to be quite valuable. So, with all of this being said, I want to summarize very briefly here. The Lutherans, though not just holding one unanimous idea on everything in philosophy, are generally influenced towards, or by, I should say, the Aristotelian Renaissance as found in Zabernella, Scaliger, and Melanchthon, and then also by Baroque scholasticism, especially as found in Suarez. That's not to say that the Lutherans do not develop their own stuff. In future videos, are going to cover those exact things. In future videos, we will go through the writings and the ideas of these various individuals to see where they're unique and interesting. But nonetheless, I think we can see them, these two movements, as the broad influences on Lutheran scholasticism. And I look forward to engaging with these Lutheran scholastics more, as well as hopefully the influences that the Lutheran scholastics were working with. So thanks all for watching. Have a great day.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.